Welcome back to the Packer Mentality Podcast. I am your host, Patrick Corrigan, and regardless of how you found me, thank you so much for being here. The Packers take the field on Friday in their first preseason game, but before they do, let's take a look at the progress of our Packers 2023 draft class. Green Bay drafted 13 players back in April, and on the eve of their first preseason game, how did they look? Whether you're someone who watched the draft and has kept up with those picks, or you're just a casual fan that wants to know if they're living up to their draft status and expectations, let's take a look. In the first round, with pick number 13, the Packers selected Lucas Van Ness. Before the draft, he was known as a big, fast, powerful, could play inside or outside, so he had position versatility. The knock on him was that he didn't start. Now, Iowa starts seniors, and Van Ness obviously didn't make it to his senior year, but he did lead Iowa in tackles for loss and sacks. And there were some that said because he wasn't a starter that perhaps the Packers drafted him too early. Now, what we've seen from Van Ness so far basically lines up with what people said before the draft, that he is big, he's fast, he is powerful. He had the nickname in college as Hercules, and he's shown that power. He's been lining up inside on the defensive line, he's been lining out outside, he's made some big plays. He had a play in practice where he threw Josiah DeGuara about 4 yards into the backfield. And the other day, in joint practices against the Bengals, he was making plays once again. So the verdict so far on Van Ness, there's nothing to dislike. Gotta like what you've seen so far. And with Rashawn Gary in practice and likely to be available in week one, the Packers should have a very good rotation of edge rushers with Preston Smith, Rashawn Gary, Van Ness, Kingsley Enagbare returns, and also have Hollins and Cox fighting out probably for that fourth or fifth or sixth spot in the rotation. Packers are in good shape at edge rusher. In the second round, Packers selected at pick number 42 tight end Luke Musgrave. For the draft, word was he has a great combination of size, speed. He's very athletic, but he did play in a run-first offense his junior year, and he did get hurt his senior year and missed a lot of the season. He has elite speed for his size. He can line up in line, which means he's lining up on the line of scrimmage as a traditional tight end, or he could line up in the slot or be spread out wide like a wide receiver. He can block, but he wasn't asked to do it a whole lot at Oregon State. So what we've seen so far in practice is exactly what we thought when he was drafted. He is really fast. It is elite speed. He is going to be a problem for defensive secondaries. He does need to work on his blocking, and Matt LaFleur has been moving him around, not unexpectedly, trying to get advantageous situations for him. And the verdict so far is it's going to be a lot of fun to have him out on the field. He is tight end 1 on the depth chart and in practice. And it's going to be a lot of fun to have him out there along with Christian Watson to raise havoc with defenses. With their second pick in the second round, the Packers selected wide receiver Jaden Reed. Now, he was known as a competitive, versatile, and fast wide receiver. He's elusive with the ball in his hands. He's a good punt returner. He had 3 returns for touchdowns. Problem was Michigan State's offense was just bad and probably hurt his status. He did have a few too many drops on easy throws, and therefore, according to some critics, he was drafted too high. So what we've seen in practice so far is he is versatile. Packers, Matt LaFleur, are using him like they did Tyler Ervin a few years ago, or McCall Hardman the last couple of years with the Chiefs, using him jet sweeps, quick routes. He's also been fielding punts, working with the special teams. He does have a lot of work to do as a blocker, but we haven't heard, or I haven't seen that he's having a whole lot of issues dropping passes, so that's good news. He is very fast, and he has been working with the first team. So the verdict on him is it's better than expected, I think, especially that he is already working with the first team. So good news there. In the third round, pick number 78, Tucker Kraft, tight end. He was known as a dual threat pass catcher and blocker coming out of college. He was a willing blocker. He is very athletic, but not quite as athletic as Luke Musgrave. He is a legitimate inline tight end, although you could use him in other ways, but he was used a lot inline in college. He was graded well by Pro Football Focus. He's good with the ball after the catch. He did get hurt his senior year, so he did miss some time. And he did go to South Dakota State. So he didn't go against the Power 5 competition, but at South Dakota State, he did put up the dominating work. He was a man among boys. What we've seen so far in camp is he is versatile. They are lining up in line as a traditional tight end. He still has some work to do as a blocker. Most rookies do, especially tight ends. He did have a really nice family night practice, and he was good in joint practices against the Bengals. And he and Musgrave are both working together and working hard, staying late, and putting in the work to be ready for the season. So it's everything you want to hear about rookies. Verdict on him so far, he's definitely behind Musgrave on the depth chart, and probably behind Tyler Davis as well so far, but he will get some opportunities. In the fourth round, Packers selected Colby Wooden out of Auburn. He was known as a physical defensive lineman with a good motor. He's very athletic, has good inside pass rush. He has positional flexibility. Packers can move him around on the defensive line. But the word was that whoever drafted him was going to need to do a lot of work, that he had a lot of learning to do, a lot of work on his technique. But he could be a good surprise. And what we've seen so far is exactly that. He's been a really nice surprise. He's a penetrator. He's had really solid practices so far in camp. And verdict on him so far is we may have a good rotational defensive lineman. And he will see a good amount of time during the games this season. In the fifth round, Packers selected quarterback Sean Clifford out of Penn State. This was a pick that was a bit controversial. What was said of him before the draft that he was smart, he was athletic, he was tough, but he was not worth drafting, and obviously was drafted too early. Now, in his defense, he was held back from because he had to work in 4 different offenses while he was in college. That's tough to do when you are learning the offense and everybody else on the team is learning the offense. Your team's going to struggle, especially when they're doing it year after year. What we've seen so far in camp is he's been solid. He's made some nice throws. Obviously, he's still making mistakes, but he's picking up the offense really well. And since they released Danny Etling the other day, looks like he right now is in line to be quarterback 2 for the Packers. So it's a solid pick if you get a backup quarterback in the 5th round. With their second pick in the 5th round, the Packers selected wide receiver Dontavian Wicks. He, coming out of college, was an athletic wide receiver, good route runner, good release skills. He dominated in 2021, but with a scheme change and the rest of the offense struggling in 2022, he took a step back. And drops were a bit of an issue for Dontavian. What we've seen in camp, he was injured a bit early in camp, but he came back and he's looked pretty good. He is a good route runner. Haven't heard a whole lot about any drops from him. Some comparisons for Dontavian, think a little bit like James Jones. Obviously, he's got a long ways to go before you can get the full comparison to James Jones, but he's a little bit like James Jones with his skill set. And right now, it looks like he's wide receiver 5, but he'll see some playing time. In the 6th round, pick number 179, Packers selected defensive lineman Carl Brooks. Coming out of college, he came from a small school. He wasn't playing top competition, but he absolutely dominated at that level. When you have an elite player playing at maybe a smaller school or at a level that he's better, you expect him to dominate, and he did. He just wrecked people. He is a big edge. He was a big edge rusher in college. He had great skill, pass rushing skills, had a lot of tools. They were well developed, but the knock was he's not as athletic as you'd like. So what we've seen so far, the Packers have moved him inside the defensive line. He does have the positional versatility and the experience and the skills to go out on the edge and set the edge, and he's done a good job, and he's been fairly dominant in practice. So, verdict so far on Carl Brooks is he's much better in this draft position, at least so far. But we do need to see him do what he's been doing in practice in game situations. So starting tomorrow night against the Bengals, we'll need to see it. Sixth round pick, kicker Anders Carlson. Coming out of college, he has a strong leg with some inconsistency, and so far in practice, at least up until Friday night, we pretty much saw strong leg and a lot of inconsistency. There was some concern that he was missing a few too many kicks, but we got to family night, and he was good. And since then, including the joint practice yesterday against the Bengals, he's been good, pretty much making everything inside of 50 yards. The few misses he's had, I think he missed a 54-yarder and a 58-yarder yesterday. Not going to get too upset about that. So far it looks like he's going to be able to do it. 7th round, and this is a guy that a lot of people are super excited about from what he's shown. Cornerback Carrington Valentine out of Kentucky. Before the draft, said that he had explosive athleticism. He led Kentucky in pass breakups. He was very aggressive, but gave up a few too many big plays, and he still needs time to learn the position. What we've seen so far in practice is better than expected. He has moved up the depth charts as a rookie. He's breaking up a lot of passes. He's been a problem for the wide receivers. You're thinking, well, it's the Packers wide receivers, but he did it against the Bengals as well. He had 2 more pass breakups in red zone practice versus the Bengals yesterday. Verdict so far is he's been moving up the depth charts. He might be next up after Rasul and Jair. And this guy looks like he could be at least right now. Looks like he could be a future starter. Their second pick in the seventh round, the Packers selected Lou Nichols. Coming out of college, he was very productive. He was big, he was powerful, he was good between the tackles. He breaks tackles, doesn't need a huge hole, but he was doing it at Central Michigan. What we've seen so far, he looks good carrying the ball, but way too many drops in the passing game. And he did injure his shoulder, so he missed some time. And verdict so far is with that injury, and just with the roster is put together right now, he is having to fight an uphill battle to make the active roster. He's still behind Patrick Taylor and Tyler Goodson, probably for one running back three. And honestly, I think the Packers are only going to take two running backs into the season on the active roster. So he'll need to have a really good preseason. With their second pick in the seventh round, Packers selected Anthony Johnson Jr. Coming out of college. He had a lot of experience in college, just not a lot of it at safety. He's very versatile. He played everywhere in the secondary for Iowa State. He played special teams. He can cover. He can tackle in space. He's a very good tackler. But he's still learning safety. What we've seen so far is kind of all that. He's a good tackler, but he's still learning a position, and he's kind of bringing up the rear in the safety battle behind all the guys that basically everyone who's got experience at the position. And he's working with the third team right now. So the verdict is he needs a good preseason to find his way onto the 53-man roster. The Packers do prioritize their rookies, or their draft picks, I should say. So that may give him an advantage over one of those 4 or 5 guys that are fighting for the starting positions. But again, the preseason, he's going to put up a good showing. With their final pick in the seventh round, pick number 256, Packers selected wide receiver Grant Dubose out of Charlotte. He was good size wide receiver, good athleticism at Charlotte. He's a polished route runner. He's got very long arms, but he's playing at Charlotte and has not competed against high-level or NFL-level corners. What we've seen so far, not much. He got hurt and only came back recently. But in the few practices that he's been back, he looks good running routes. Verdict for him, as far as the 53-man roster is, he's really behind at a tough position. He's got a lot of ground to make up in a short period of time, and the preseason will be the key for him as well. Likely looking at the practice squad if he can clear waivers. Now, this group of draft picks have the potential to not only be one of the best draft classes the Packers have had in a long time, but also have a huge effect this season. I like what I've seen and heard so far, but there is still a long way to go. The Packers will take on the Bengals on Friday night. I'll be back on Monday to talk about where things stand with the roster. Before you leave, please hit the subscribe button. Until then, have a great rest of your week. Be safe, and go Pack Go.